Did you? All right. Thank you very much, Adam. Good evening, everyone. To all of you here in the audience, it's great to see you all. And to all those watching online, it promises, I hope, to be a lively evening as we discuss an issue the World Economic Forum, no less, believes is one of the great challenges of our time, up there with terrorism and poor governance, namely misinformation or fake news. Are we living in a post-factual age, and if so, what does it mean for democracy itself? I'll give you a quick anecdote, personal anecdote, as I'll never forget being BBC Washington correspondent back in 2004 and being told by a Bush administration official trying to explain that the Iraq war was going swimmingly, that he said, the problem with you journalists, Clive, is that you live in a fact-based world. We, the administration, make our own facts. It's interesting, isn't it? The problem for him was that the facts were clear to everyone on the ground, on television. But if the facts aren't obvious, if they're contested, what then? And can lies be facts? Are all facts just interpretation? Well, we've got a fantastic panel here to discuss all of this. Starting on my right, Kerry-Ann Mendoza is editor-in-chief of The Canary, an online website positioning itself outside the mainstream media. It describes itself as fair, fearless, and fully independent, bringing a fresh take on news and politics. Neil Breakwell is the London bureau chief of Vice News, the online current affairs and news channel with a nightly news programme, Vice News Tonight, broadcast on HBO. It sees itself and sees its remit as to cover stories not reported by the mainstream outlets, and it primarily focuses, although it has a wide reach, but it targets a younger millennial audience. I should say that Neil used to work for the former crusty old-fashioned media, the BBC. Yeah. Ella Whelan, on my left here, is assistant editor of the online magazine Spiked, which has the tagline, Online Off-Message News, focusing on politics, science, liberties and culture. And Ivor Gaber is Professor of Journalism at the University of Sussex, and before that, a politician, a political journalist. You jumped in there so quickly. No. Based at Westminster, working for the BBC, ITN, Channel 4 News and Sky, and is now actually back on the road for ITN for the current election campaign. Please welcome our panel. Now, as Adam indicated, we want all of those watching the conversation to join in. You can do so if you're watching online by tweeting using the hashtag sussexconvo, C-O-N-V-O, Sussex Convo. So do send your questions in to us and the members of the audience here with us. We'd like to hear your questions a little bit later on too. But I want to begin with the panel first of all and ask a question that might seem obvious, but I want your individual take on this. What exactly is fake news? Kerry-Ann.
I don't know, I think in the olden days we used to call them lies. And that's essentially what fake news is. I think we've fallen into a trap, all sides of the media at the moment, and politicians too, of essentially describing anything with which we disagree as fake news, because it's become this sort of most powerful insult that can be levied at any outlet. If we read something we don't like, it's fake news, it's not news we disagree with, it's not news which is poorly researched. And I think it's really important that we make the distinction between lies and things with which we disagree. It's a very important caveat. I know we had a discussion in our newsroom when fake news became this sort of buzzword. It seemed like anyone who put fake news in the title of an article, you know, everyone was flocking to it. And we took an editorial decision to use it infrequently and with appropriate evidence for the assertion. And I do wish a lot of the more kind of liberal outlets as well would have taken the same approach, because unfortunately what's happened now, particularly in the US with the Trump administration, is the sort of the Breitbarts and InfoWars of the world have now decided to seize upon that narrative themselves, and simply dismissing everything that criticises the absolutely toxic politics of that, you know, right-wing Trumpist kind of universe as fake and fraudulent. So I think we need to be very, very careful about how we use it.
Okay, Neil, fake news is lies.
Yeah, there's lies are involved, but I suppose it's not like there's one stripe of fake news, and it sort of exists at like a sort of volume, louder and quieter depending on where it exists. So you know, there's a kind of out and out blatant lie from start to finish, just a complete work of fiction that is published. And I think the question of where it's published is another matter, in that, like, at what point does it become news? Usually once it's being reported and lots of people are seeing it. So if I just said to myself in the privacy of my own home something nonsense, it's not fake news, but I made it up. So it's sort of two things of like, what scale? But then there's lots of things which are to some extent true. There's a basis of fact in the story, but some bits of it aren't true, or it's misaligned. And then I think the sort of third area would be actually just selection of stories, or the weight and the essentially the sort of precedence you give to one side of view or another, and that comes into sort of questions of impartiality. So it's the difficulty with sort of working out and what you call fake news is that it's not applied in the same singular way each time. It's got multi ways of feeding into the system, and where it actually originates from is also very hard to actually sort of nail down.
All right, okay. So Ellen, it's a lie. It's got to be published, but there could be an element of truth in there.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of very fascinating concept, fake news, because as my fellow panelists have said, when you take it in its literal sense, it is news that is fake, it's lies, it can be spin and gossip, and all these things fall under what some people consider to be fake news. But I think what the concept really has taken on is not in itself the false reporting or the news. It's this sort of fake news now is a moral panic. I think it's become much less about the actual fact of news that is published that is not well researched or that is plainly made up. But it's become this thing that I think sort of people in the media establishment and members of the political class whisper in their nightmares. It's this dreaded fear of a lack of control over information. It's the fear that we can't control what news people are consuming anymore. We can't control what political views people have anymore. Everything is sort of up for grabs. So fake news is when politicians talk about the blight that fake news is on democracy, what they're really not actually addressing is the problem that as journalists we should say are concerned about in not researching properly or poor journalism, but is actually this moral panic about information not being sort of kept under control and dampened and channeled in a certain way. So it's really taken on a whole new meaning, I think.
Ivor, do you agree with that?
Up to a point, Lord Copper, up to a point. I think the real issue is this, and it's a bit of a conundrum. Fake news can be true and truth can be fake. And by that I mean, I sound like a professor, aren't I? By that I mean it's the intent. So for example, you can have an intent to deceive using truth. I'll give one quick example. The UK sends £350 million to the EU every week. Actually, that can be interpreted as true, because that is the UK. That was how much the UK owes the EU every week. What it neglects to say is we get 100 million back. And so actually the true figure, if you like, is 250 million. But that piece of propaganda, if you like, which the media then portrayed, including the blessed BBC, by allowing that wretched bus to fill our screens every night, actually was those statements it is there's an interpretation of that is true, but actually the intention was to deceive. And similarly, you can have things that are wrong broadcast, but actually they're mistakes or they're misinterpretation. So the issue of facts is secondary, in my view, to the intent. And the intent of fake news is to deceive.
Going back to that £350 million figure, the side of the bus said, we send £350 million.
Ish.
It's wrong, isn't it? It's wrong. We do not, there's no interpretation of that, Kerry-Ann, really, is there? Because we do not send £350 million. So that was actually a lie.
Yeah, well, I think the bigger lie is, you know, as you're saying, is it's not only that they deceived about the sum of money, how it's transmitted to the EU, but then was the lie that they followed up with, which was the whole NHS. Let's spend it on the NHS. And again, if we were to be very pedantic about it, in fact, I get these tweets fairly frequently from UKIPers, which is to say, but look at the bus again. It says we could. Yes. We could spend, and you know, come on, guys, semantics. You know, everyone's reading that bus thinking there was a promise, and certainly the way that promise was then discussed by the likes of Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage. More important in Boris Johnson's case because he could have been in a position to fulfil that promise. Nigel Farage was never going to be. You know, essentially, democracy relies on informed consent, and that is what is so dangerous about these sorts of, you know, lies, essentially, is because people then use their chance to participate in the democratic system and they tick the wrong box because they've been fed nonsense, essentially. And that's how we came to Brexit.
All right.
Well, the point I would make is that those that would have maybe, you know, if a bit of the Today programme on Newsnight had actually, which I'm sure they do in various forms, take that 350 million quid figure and properly explain that it's not quite that much going over and that some of it comes back. The truth is that the sort of number of people that actually hear that proper analysis of that information compared to the number of people that were broadly sort of rather sort of Eurosceptic, and a lot of their friends may have been, and therefore what they actually see in their newsfeed, which is where they get their news from, is not just dipping into that 1 Minute Today programme, or if we assume that they do it accurately, is to just see this sort of floating image of the bus go past in their feed. So it's not as if, like, if someone just points this out, it'll all be solved. If now people's news experience is actually surrounded by broadly their sort of opinions that is reflected back at them. And so, to extent, mainstream media, we are sort of minnows in the stream of news that people receive. Mm-hmm. The mainstream media, by which I mean, it's just not, it's not people's experience of what they actually see. And they will have seen 350 quid, you can spend it on the NHS. That for them would be better.
350 million
quid.
Diane Abbott here. But Ellen, is any of this new? I mean, I started with an anecdote from 2004, and I think there may be a perception out there that all this has come in with, you know, Brexit and Donald Trump and whatever. How new is this phenomenon?
It's not new at all, actually. We've had, I'm delighted that the bus has come up because for me it was sort of fascinating because politicians have told, you know, incredibly worse lies in the past, have you know, have a history of spin, of propaganda, of outright telling falsehoods. So this bus was not anything new. It was not sort of the explosion of this new phenomenon of fake news. And you can take it right back to, you know, one of Spike's kind of political heroes, John Wilkes, in the 18th century, purposefully produced fake news because he was trying to rankle the establishment and fought for the right to report on what was going on in Parliament. It was a very important tussle with who has control over the news, who has control over what the public consumes. And what the panic about the bus and about UKIP's intervention into the Brexit discussion really revealed to me, which was you know, much more fearful and much more dangerous than, you know, really people reading something, a slogan that's put on the side of a bus. There's been plenty of terrible slogans on the sides of buses. Was the reaction to it, because what the reaction was really, to kind of paraphrase, is these idiots out there, these sort of Brexit voting plebs who are eating this news from Nigel Farage, who are just consuming this information and are going to feed that misinformation into their decision at the ballot box. And now that is just such a low view and such a patronising view of the public. And really what the discussion after around Brexit and after the kind of fury over the bus really revealed is how low and how kind of distrusting we are, how low our view is of the public's ability to interpret, to be kind of skeptical of news, to make their own decisions, political decisions. And you know, the idea that the public just sort of consume news and regurgitate that, it has never been true and is not true now. You know, you don't need a PhD in journalism to understand that what Farage puts on the side of the bus may not be true.
But Ivor, it's also a reflection, isn't it, of the distrust that the public has for the so-called established media, the old media. You know, because people are desperate for news, information that is coming from a source that they believe is more credible than what they've had, which is the established media.
Yeah, you get a very ambivalent attitude, though. If you look at public opinion research about attitudes to the establishment, if you like, politicians, and the media, on the one hand you get a very negative, oh, we don't believe a word they say, and yet they will repeat the tabloid news headlines. So that there is this notion of we don't believe a word that we read, and then they will repeat what's been fed to them through the mainstream media. The tabloid press remains a remarkably powerful agenda setter. Even as its circulation goes down, it's still setting the political agenda. And we've seen that throughout in 2015, the election, in the Brexit, and in this referendum, this election. It still remains very powerful. Now, if you're going to ask me what's the direct effect, somebody doesn't pick up a newspaper and say, oh yes, I agree with that, I'm going to change my view. It's much more complex than that. But echo chambers are not new. Echo chambers existed when people who read the Daily Mirror talked to other people who read the Daily Mirror, or people who read the Daily Mail did the same. Echo chambers are not new, it's just their intensity and their speed is new.
So what do you think then of Spiked and the Canary?
What do I think of them?
Yeah.
I think, let us... I'm a great believer in today. I'm stealing your line here, but today is World Press Freedom Day, and I let 1,000 flowers bloom. I want to hear as many voices as possible, as long as they're not preaching hatred and violence. So Canary, I see regularly, because I also see right-wing blog spots as well. I think it's very important, though. I know where Canary is coming from. And I know where, for example, there's a famous blog, Order, which is Guido Fawkes's book. I know where that's coming from. I'm a little unsure where Spiked is coming from. So and I know where the BBC is coming from. So I think it's terribly important in an online environment where we can't go into a newsagent and buy the shop to have transparency in our news sources.
Okay, you know where it's coming from, but you are a professor of journalism. I mean, the truth is that most people, A, don't know, and B, don't really care whether what they're reading is what the source of that is. And sometimes it's stuff that may have come originally actually from a sort of the mainstream media and been reprocessed and put back out. And the sense is that people just assume news is presented as news, and they don't go through, because why should they bother, the check of actually what is the level of journalistic work that has gone behind it. And I think that's where it's very difficult for people to actually, where the efforts and resource that goes into real proper journalism gets polluted by bad journalism, which at its extreme is fake news, because people aren't distinguishing when it's actually being consumed often on the same platform, be it Google or Facebook, that they're not able to distinguish where is this from. All
right, okay. Neil, I know you work for a competing organisation to BuzzFeed, but what was your view of BuzzFeed deciding to put online, without any editorial cipher or control, the whole of that dossier that suggested that Donald Trump was in bed with the Russians and, frankly, in bed with lots of other things?
It's tricky. I've got some sympathy for the calculations that they make, which is that this is a document that's being discussed by the people in power, that is in the possession of all of the media, and it's a live political debate that is ongoing which has huge consequences to the voters and the public. And the only people not getting a glimpse of this stuff at the moment to try and get some workings out themselves of where the debate is going is the public.
But they could have put it out there, having gone through it,
Yeah,
and taken out the stuff that was clearly, obviously unverifiable.
And I think that's where I would land. That actually you shouldn't be in the act of just publishing. Yeah, it does. It does. But I think where there is, they allowed themselves it to be a question. I don't think there's many journalists who didn't actually sort of sit there for quite a bit of time thinking, would I, wouldn't I? They were very. I think what they tried to do about it was to say, we cannot verify this, but it's being spoken about a lot. Over to you guys. And I think it's sort of forced. The problem is journalists are now increasingly sort of forced to think this will arrive in the public domain, come what may. We know BuzzFeed are a business. I'm sure they got a lot of hits out of it. You can see the pressures to actually sort of just put stuff into the public is increasingly hot on broadcasters.
The thing is, though, our job is to resist those pressures. That's why we, the Canary, we've got a 6-gate editorial process that we have to go through for each story. We've published the biggest story we've ever published tonight on, allegations of election fraud by the Conservative Party. That investigation was 14 months in the running. And we had, essentially the bones of it 14 months ago. And we have spent every day since then going through, bottom lining every single detail of that story.
So that is calling it fake news.
No, not that story. It's a different story. But right. BuzzFeed attack us for fake news on a fairly regular basis. But what I wanted to know, it absolutely wasn't. Right. We're issuing a rebuttal on that. Right. The point is, though, I actually think the worst thing that BuzzFeed is doing right now is not that classified story. It's the fact that they are actually suing the Press Gazette to gain the identity of an anonymous source that had worked for them and made negative comments about BuzzFeed. And now I think as journalists on World Press Freedom Day, if we can't agree that pressurising news outlets to give up the identities of anonymous sources is wrong, there's something wrong with this.
I'm going to have to come in there because BuzzFeed aren't here to defend themselves. Sadly, we'd love them to have been here. But Carrie-Anne makes, Neil rather made a really interesting point. The pressure was there on BuzzFeed to dump all this stuff out there in your day, on the road, and at the BBC and most other old media establishments. If we couldn't verify something, we wouldn't put any of it out there.
Yeah, but the
BuzzFeed went completely the other way.
Well, I'll make two observations. Firstly, the BBC and the public service broadcasters, for that matter, ITN and Sky, are not really in the business of, well, they didn't used to be in the business of scoops and exclusives. We saw ourselves as slightly pretentiously the journal of record. This is what happened today. And scoops were what newspapers did, because public service broadcasters felt then, and hopefully feel now, that that's not quite their business. It's different for different departments of the BBC. So that's my first observation. Secondly, I think you're being a bit harsh on BuzzFeed because it was published elsewhere. And it was, I hate the phrase public interest because everybody uses it, but this was the president, I'm trying to remember if he was the president by then, I think it was, or president-elect, but anyway, he was an important man, and these were very serious allegations. So would I have made that decision? I don't know. But we're in a different climate here where it's intensely competitive and an organisation like BuzzFeed lives or dies by its hits, as does Vice News, I guess. Less so Canary, presumably in the Spike, because you've both got a political motivation. But we have
membership donations as well, which
Well, that's the point that I'm going to come to, Carrie-Anne. You get your revenue from people clicking.
No, we don't. That's only part of our revenue, and it's not even the biggest element of our revenue.
But it is part of the revenue stream that allows you to continue your operation.
But then every single media outlet, which doesn't have a licence fee, has commercial pressures. It has to sell papers, or it has to gain revenue somewhere.
Absolutely.
And certainly what we want to do, we set up 18 months ago with £500. We had no external investment, we had no government grant. We set up completely independently of all of those things. And since then, one of our main revenue streams is actually people who read the Canary day in, day out, and say, do you know what, we're going to put our hand in our pocket and give you a couple of pounds a month to help you along the way. And when you've got several thousands of people doing that, it essentially helps bootstrap, I think, editorial integrity, because you know that actually we're not dependent on advertising revenue, and over time we'll become less and less and less dependent on advertising revenue.
It doesn't have the opposite effect on editorial control, in that you have to put up a headline there that is going to grab someone so that they click.
No, I think the thing that people don't understand, I think maybe who don't work in online media, is essentially every story is a front page. So every story that you put out is a front page. So you do have to put that level of effort into, okay, and it's not, I think there's this real kind of cynical view of it. What we try and do is we say, okay, if I didn't go to university, if I didn't know all of these buzzwords, if I don't come from a political background, what is it about this story that would resonate with me? How would I know to read it? Because it's certainly one of the problems we identified in the sort of alternative, for want of a better phrase, the alternative media, was that while the sort of mainstream media, apart from the tabloids, was still like fairly middle class, using a fairly academic style of language, those issues were then replicated in the alternative media space. And the problem with that is it's actually incredibly exclusionary language to people who don't live in that world, who don't speak that language. And what we wanted to be able to do was reach those people. Because, do you know what? There are currently outlets that are speaking to those people every day, and they're called the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Daily Express, the Star. And so our question was, well, how do you get a progressive message to those audiences? Like, how do we speak a language that doesn't sound stuffy,
Daily Mail readers are not reading the Canary, are they? I mean, you obviously do still.
We don't have to get their literal readers. Well, we've actually reached a hell of a lot of people. We've reached already around 60 million people, so we're doing quite well.
It's a much more fragmented media market, and you have a slice of that, and that's certainly important for your readers and the people who click on your website. Ellen, I mean, do you believe, as Kerry-Ann is suggesting, that pressure for those websites that are out there that do rely on people clicking in order to get revenue, that pressure doesn't affect the editorial line of the website?
I think it's just anyone can know that there is a difference between something which is, the word is clickbait, which is solely searching for clicks for what's called going viral, which tends to be gossip or tends to be sort of salacious things, which I think has a very I think it has a place in news, gossip, and I'm a big fan of, this is terrible to say as a journalist perhaps, but I'm a fan of gossip as long as it's understood to be gossip. But you know, publications work on the basis of their reputation, and what I really mean by that is they work on the basis of what the public thinks of them, of what they are known to be. And so at Spiked we have a very solid editorial line, and we have, you know, put politics to the forefront of all of our articles, and that's what gains us our audience, because people come to us for solid political analysis. But what's really kind of the sort of almost, dare I say it, the elephant in the room here is what we're really talking about in terms of the dangers of clickbait, the dangers of editorial lines being compromised for commercial gain, is that that can somehow hamper what the public consumes. And really the answer to that from many of those who are concerned about fake news is to clamp down on what can be published. So the BuzzFeed thing for us was, as fellow journalists, we thought it was very disappointing that BuzzFeed chose to, and it's attempting to be a reputable news source, chose to publish things that it knew wasn't verifiable, it knew was salacious. So that, in terms of, you can very much condemn that level of journalism and say, guys, you really dropped the ball here. But I would actually absolutely defend, you know, to the death, it's right to publish it. That's the difference. It's right. Fake news, there's nothing gratuitously good about telling lies. What is good and beneficial is that those lies are free to be told.
Right. Okay. Let's go to the audience now. Paul, I think, is up there and has a question for us. There you are.
Opinion varies on how far newspapers, which are regulated, will affect the outcome of elections. But do you agree that the unregulated social media will have more effect?
Neil?
I mean, I think it's different in this country to the States, for example, because I think the papers, the papers actually go pretty viral now as well, and they're incredibly political. So,
and they have websites.
And they have websites, and the Daily Mail is a huge online presence, and so and obviously they're slightly different mode to the paper. Look, I think election. Who would have thought we'd be looking at the outcome of this election? Does the polls look like it's going to be a sort of landslide of May compared to 2 years ago? And so I think there's sort of bigger shifts than someone suddenly working out a very slick online campaign to have, I think it's probably more something to do with Jeremy Corbyn being the leader of the Labour Party, which is why the election is looking like it's going to unfold as it does. So I don't know. I think they're not central to outcomes of election, but how close? If it's close, yeah. But
if it's close, but it doesn't potentially look as if it's going to be, Ellen.
This is a kind of the new thing that we have now, social media, that this new technology where everybody can have an opinion about about a political process. Everyone can have a say in elections, in referendums, and that's surely a good thing, because more opinions and more voices is always beneficial. But this sort of the fear of how social media affects elections, this was voiced in terms of, did Twitter make Trump happen? Did Twitter make Brexit happen? These were things that were sort of, again, it was a panic about who has control over the political discussion, who is able to maneuver the message. And if you have anybody talking on Twitter and anybody with the possibility to have their tweet go viral, then obviously that's sort of fearful for politicians, because the wrong thing, in their opinion, can get out. But, the Twitter is a great sort of, it's terrible in some ways, in terms of people can spend endless hours on it talking absolute rubbish, in my opinion. But the great thing about it is that it democratizes news to a certain
regulation
extent.
Is a bad idea.
Absolutely. If there's one thing,
okay,
Spike stands for, it's for the absolute freedom of speech and absolute freedom of the press.
Ivor, do you think regulation is the issue?
Well, no. First, let me pick up, Paul said our newspapers are regulated. They're not really. Broadcasting is regulated, but not newspapers. But let me come to the main point. I don't disagree with what's been said, but I think we have. I've done some research on the impact of social media on political voting. I think the answer is not much, but in terms of people's consuming political news. But the big impact looks like the elephant in the room. You say the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the way that social media can be and is being used for advertising purposes. The Conservatives spent in the 2015 election millions on brilliant use of targeted Facebook ads, messages, videos. They're doing it again. I think it was terribly important in Brexit, and if you've been reading The Guardian, there's been some very interesting stuff, and the Electoral Commission is now investigating that. So I think we have to distinguish between social media, and I love Twitter. I think Twitter, and there's a lot of data now out there, Twitter has very little impact in terms of shifting opinions. And obviously it's not an advertising-free zone, but it cannot compete with Facebook. And Facebook is a brilliant device for political campaigners rather than journalists.
We did ask Facebook, by the way, and Google and some of the other big internet giants to give their opinion and be involved, but they didn't want to. Just very quickly, get in touch.
It's just interesting because it strikes me that this is what you've said there about the kind of the thing about advertising being dangerous is very much the same. That advertising is something that influences people, whether that be for good or bad, during elections. That it's this kind of very strong force. Is the same concern, I think, about fake news. It's a concern with what people do with that information. So many. Perhaps not you ever, but many people are very worried about the effect of advertising in terms of kind of political decisions, because they say they use terms like brainwashed. They say people are sort of consuming adverts, or kind of being led, or being fed messages. And again, that's the same with fake news. It's a complete removal of people's individual political agency. It's a complete removal of the idea that someone can watch this very flashy, political advert and have all their sort of critical capabilities removed. Of course, that doesn't happen. People, you know, people have always been able to look beyond a message, to consider a message, to perhaps believe in it if it's very effective. But the point is, it's that the decision is within that person's individual capabilities, not some kind of, you know, magic power of making people to switch off their brains, really.
Okay, Kerry-Ann, would it help people to deal, the public to deal with whatever fake news or stories that with a veracity that is difficult to pin down? Would it help if there was, alongside on the internet, a website where you could check stuff? So this whole idea from the founder of Wikipedia, for instance, of a website that people can click on and actually cross-check things.
The thing with that is, though, who watches the watchers? Who regulates that website? You know, who's the Ministry of Truth? You know, in this situation, we already have an abundance of high-quality fact-checking websites. I use them, like the likes of Snopes and others. I use one of the things that we do at the Canary, because we're conscious one of the benefits of online journalism is that you can link to source. So actually everything is hyperlinked, so you don't have to believe us. You know, you can go and click through, read the report yourself. And we do make an effort every time as well to use primary sources rather than quoting other media outlets, so that actually you can have a longer read if you're sitting in the bath and have the time. That would be my preferred approach. I think we can even start this sooner at the level of childhood in schools. I think it's a scandal that we don't kind of get into critical thinking until university level. I think if we were teaching at primary school and secondary level, critical thinking, essay writing, the picking apart of ideas, I think that is really where we should be investing the time and money on this issue, is actually creating a level of public literacy, actually, which has us as canny readers, canny listeners, so that when we're, whether it's politicians or media outlets or whoever else is trying to sell us an idea or a view, that we can actually come back with that robustly.
Okay, but the Canary, you know, makes a point of saying that it puts news out there that other people, you know, aren't reporting. Could that be interpreted by some people as the Canary putting out their alternative news, alternative facts?
Well, everyone's got an opinion, so I'm sure they're welcome to it if that's their view. I'd ask them to evidence it. I think what we focus on is not just alternatives, so we're not contrarians, you know, just saying, well, we're going to say something different. What we focus on is the underreported, unreported and misreported stories. That's our focus. So you say, okay, we'll look at this, you know, and actually, you know, people say, oh, you know, what are our most read stories from the last year? Well, one was on the privatisation of the land registry. That was one of our most popular stories last year because people suddenly realised how important this land registry was. And that was great for us because actually we're helping advance a policy debate. You know, we're not going, oh, you know, doing gossip or look at Kim Kardashian's new lipstick. We're actually saying, let's break open this policy which could affect us all and look at how it affects us. All right. Same with WASPy women on pensions. You know, there's a great level of interest in that. So that's where we come from, is how can we advance the policy debate.
That sounds all great, Neil, doesn't it? That sounds all fine. Yet, there are a lot of people out there who are very worried, who are very concerned about this space, the internet, with all this plethora of stuff that's on there that is difficult in some respects to pin down in terms of the truthfulness of what people are reading.
Yeah, but I sort of circle back to that point I made about that people aren't knowing where their news is coming from. And that is a responsibility of the sort of platform that publish to make sure that they're not... it is Facebook that's saying this is news. And they are actually offering this stuff because they get ad money from it and it arrives there. They don't really care, frankly, whether it's money from Channel 4 news videos or whether it's from some complete loon. So long as they're getting loads of hits from it, it's Facebook that profits from it. And I think that if that was filtered out more by the platforms that say, it's not to say it can't be published somewhere, but to actually sort of lump it as news and present it as such. I think there needs to be a sort of clearer way of where has this stuff come from. And I think that would give people slightly more confidence in when they see stuff as presented as news, that actually behind that has had actual proper journalistic work done, and that's expensive. And the difficulty for lots of news outlets that make stuff and publish it on these platforms, because it is a big audience there, is they just don't get the money from it that they probably should.
All right, okay. Let's open it out to the audience now. Gentleman over there on my left. And if you could just give us your name and where you're from, please. Thank you.
My name's Adrian Greeman. I'm from Tooting. My real question here is surely the biggest fake news is that we live in any kind of a free society at all, or there is something called democracy where we all get a choice about what happens in the world. It's run by big money. It's run by capitalism. This question, which comes down to should we have communism perhaps, will never get discussed. It never gets talked about. You can have all kinds of partial freedoms and partial discussions, but the really big questions, and that about communism and so on, will never get talked about. And that's why people are beginning to wake up to the fact that they live in something which isn't freedom, and they've spotted that what they've been fed for decades is actually fake news.
Ellen.
I mean, I think in part you're right, because we, at the moment, though I've spiked and I would very much like to have a truly free society, we do not have a free press. We do not have absolute freedom of speech in the UK. With the Leveson Inquiry, Investigative Powers Act, now the suggested Espionage Act, the newspapers, and press freedom is completely under threat, to the point of real panic among journalists at Spiked and our fellow journalists and other publications. It is our ability to say what we want, to kind of have freedom of speech, is very much under attack. So you're certainly right there. There has been a shift though, and in terms of public engagement with wanting that freedom, with wanting democracy. Brexit was that, in my opinion, writ large. It was the demand for more democracy. And when in relation to news and to press freedom, there is a kind of, when I argue that it's good to have a healthy skepticism, having a real kind of cynicism about news and about publications isn't beneficial, because that means that as journalists and as publications we're doing something wrong. And like my fellow panelists have said, it's incumbent upon journalists and people who are in the business of producing news to do that well, and to do that well is to be in the pursuit of truth. But there is a public and a kind of political demand among the public for more information, for more democracy, for more control over these things which were previously over there.
Okay, Ivor, do you believe that we live in with a media that is essentially broken?
No. I mean, I think, just to talk about this country, we have both the best and the worst media in the world. I hate that statement because, people make it and I don't know all the media in the world, but essentially we've got, and foreign journalists visiting are shocked by our tabloids. They are shocked by them. And on the other hand, we have, I don't know any other country in the world that has 5 national quality dailies. I include the Independent because they've got a very good website. I think public service broadcasting, the BBC, plus the constellation that surrounds it, is a great plus. But I can be as critical as anybody about the British media. It is not broken. It ain't perfect. It struggles. There are issues. But can I just make the point that I've worked in many countries around the world which capitalist and non-capitalist alike, and the temptation for governments when they get in power to seize control of the media is overwhelming. And I think we have to recognise, no matter how well motivated they are, and they're doing it for the best possible reasons for the people, it's bad. All right.
Okay, let's take another question then from the audience. Gentleman up there at the back.
Yes, hello. I'm Sebastian. I'm from Brussels. So,
welcome.
Thank you. You can guess where my question is coming from. In order to be able to debunk lies and bust myths on a complex issue like Brexit, journalists themselves really need a deep level of expertise to be able to do this. Do you think the BBC has the requisite level in order to challenge the false statements, or at least had it at the time of the referendum? And secondly, was fear of licence fee review a factor in the BBC's approach to Brexit, which I think was quite soft?
Okay. Neil, I'm going to start with you. on this one, because you used to work for Newsnight.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you could address those
look,
points.
there's some real problems that yeah, you're right. I was still at Newsnight at the time of the Brexit referendum, so we went through that sort of fun. I suppose the struggle they get, the Brexit referendum was a real struggle for the BBC because it throws itself obviously into having to cover elections, and with that comes this aching need for balance, and with that both sides, and this is obviously where the media gets into difficulties, because it relies so much on the same sorts of voices, essentially, you know, media whores like us, who live in London and metropolitan elite types that generally are the ones who appear on telly or have had some role or space in public life or have been legislators. So when we were sort of casting for discussions on Newsnight during that referendum, the absolute difficulty, serious logistical difficulty, was actually finding anyone had ever heard of that was available on the Brexit side. So all former ministers, you know, just the full range of former ministers, and if you can, especially in places like in the arts, they're all Remainers. You know, the people that actually compete in political life and in media life were pretty heavy in the Remain camp. So you then have to get on this argument of total balance, and I think that unsettled people. And then, of course, it was a difficulty of this idea that we have two people on, and we have to give the same amount of time to questioning the 350 million bus figure, and then we've got to sort of flip it round and argue equal time and weight to some other argument outside of that bus, rather than just sort of actually going, what's probably the most ludicrous figure that's being bandied around and being misused here. So the calculations in referendum campaigns for places like the BBC is incredibly difficult because of this ache to and contortion to kind of balance up the argument, rather than perhaps dispassionately going, who here seems to be saying the biggest bit of nonsense. That's the difficulty the BBC has in campaigns. You had a second point, I forget. License fee. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I don't think the licence fee debate played into that at all. Kerry-Ann, it's interesting that the Canary leans towards the Corbyn side of politics.
Leans towards the progressive side of politics.
Okay, progressive side of politics. Do you believe? Okay, so from that point of view then, given the confusion that there is within the Labour Party over Brexit, what was your view of the BBC's coverage?
I think actually the BBC's Brexit coverage was some of the best reporting they've done, actually. We weren't attacking the BBC over its Brexit coverage, and as you know, we're fairly commonly having a pop at the BBC. And I do think the BBC's role is different from other outlets. You know, the BBC is a public broadcaster. We're all paying our licence fee. There is a greater need to find impartiality. I think where the BBC falls down sometimes is that the truth isn't impartial. And I think there's a real danger when you have this kind of obsession with impartiality, that you actually do a disservice to truth. You know, if you've got, you know, climate change, for example, and you give equal time to someone representing 1% of climate scientists, you know, who think it doesn't exist, where there's 99% who do, I think you actually then distort the issue, and you leave people with the impression that it's a 50-50 scenario and not a 99% to 1%. Scenario. And I think that was a little bit of a problem, I think, during the Brexit debate, because you say when there were just, you know, outright fibs being told by both sides, you know, that whole EU referendum became so hyper-partisan that it was difficult to cut through on both sides. Right. There were ludicrous figures banging about.
Yeah, well, until its demise, I was what was called an independent editorial advisor to the BBC Trust, advising on complaints. Balance doesn't occur anywhere in the editorial guidelines for the very reason that you're pointing out. Ban it, and that was the problem for me with the BBC coverage, what we call false equivalence. Balance can be very misleading. There aren't always two sides, and sometimes there are many sides. But the constructive or the disappointing constructive point. The BBC had a way out of this problem. They had a very good operation which is still going called Reality Check, their own fact-checking service. In my view, they did have to try and give equal time, not necessarily balance, to both sides. But then I think, and this is perhaps a lesson for the current campaign, they should give almost equal prominence to, but just to take the 350 million, I'm not going to go over that, but BBC Reality Check says that actually the real figure is this. And I think that's what a public service broadcaster can do.
You can't do that after every single interview. And the Reality Check segment was there.
Very well hidden. Very well hidden. How many times did you see it on the 10? Okay, you might have seen it on Newsnight. You might have seen it on BBC News Online, but on the big shows, it played a very small role. And that was the disappointment, because it's a very good operation.
Sure, sure. Okay, another question, please. From the audience. Yes, you over there.
Hello, I'm Hannah Robbins from Sussex. One of the lively things in social media to make people think about things is things like the TED Talks, and I'm thinking of the late, great Hans Rosling, who talked about data about the whole world and what's going on compared to people's beliefs. Now, those beliefs may have been based upon very good journalism, but it's been extrapolated so that people believe that all over the world Muslim women don't have access to education, which is not true. And I wonder what the panel think, what, if anything, can be done to put these misapprehensions right?
Ellen, I'd like to direct Hannah's question to you, because you firmly believe in free speech, and I think most people do, and an unregulated internet. How do you deal with those kinds of misconceptions in a world which is essentially a free-for-all?
I think that what you do is you trust people to make their own decisions, and you trust that people do engage wholly in the conversation.
Clearly, people are under the misapprehension that Muslim women all over the world are being persecuted.
I don't think everybody believes that, certainly, and there is a danger. There's a danger. One of the examples that's frequently used is there was, after the kind of the discussions about immigration in Europe, there was news went round that there was a kind of big, horrible, free-for-all, terrible attack on women in a certain European country, which turned out to be completely untrue. And that was spread not just on social media, but by almost all news publications. But the whole point was the effect that has is, and the scope with which that is taken up is dependent upon our ability as a public to tussle with, to argue with, to investigate into these facts. And so just bringing it back to Brexit, and when we're talking about the BBC's coverage of it, the interesting thing for me that happened with the BBC, I think it did cover it fairly well, but what it did was, at one point, it made a decision to refer to the EU as Europe. Now, in its discussions, it said, we're not going to say EU, we're going to say Europe. Now, that is politically loaded from a a Brexit supporter like me. Is that fake news? It's not. They're not lying, but it's a certain bias. The final point that I'd make is that facts are absolutely key to good journalism, but the argument and your political input and the way that you frame your argument is also absolutely crucial.
Okay, but going back to Hannah's point, if you have an internet that is essentially lawless, how do you call out instances where stuff is on there that suggests that all Muslim women are persecuted around the world? How do you deal with that?
It's actually very easy. Publications that have reputations for being reputable, for being in pursuit of the truth, publications that have sort of public trust, whether that be someone's opinion, the BBC, or whether that be someone like Spiked or the Canary, people who are in the business of putting out, or believed to be in the business of putting out truth, to condemn that. So I think we have to actively, when those lies are being told, reputable journalists have to come out and say this isn't true and prove it. The way that it's going is that we're calling for Twitter and Facebook and social media outlets to be censored by external bodies. Now, that isn't a solution.
Not censored,
That is
censored, to regulate.
Which is self-censorship. Who in Twitter? Who in Twitter would you trust to kind of be your ministry of truth? I can't think of who.
I just think it's sort of a bit after the horse has bolted. I mean, if we went on Newsnight, no one's watching Newsnight. They're in bed. Let's see. It's a tiny. I mean, I love the show. I love the show. I love the show dearly, and unfortunately, the few people that do watch it, most are in the cabinet, so it has a kind of kick. But the idea that you correct this sort of galloping lie that's spread off across the internet by saying, on Newsnight, we can prove that to be incorrect and just clarify that for the whole world. It's just not. It's not going to happen. I just think if you are a platform that publishes and says this is news and it's bollocks, you should take it down.
Carrie, and how do you deal with that then? Do you not deal with it? You just leave it out there? These misconceptions, these lies, the fake news, you just leave it out there and you hope that the public know where to go to get the facts?
No, I think plurality is really important. I think, that's certainly what us and Spiked have in common, in particular, is about saying, look, we do have a media in this country, whether you like it or not. It's simply a fact that, a significant chunk of it is owned by like 6 rich white guys. And they don't own it because, the kindness of their hearts. They own it because they want a political outlet. They want to have influence over people's views and opinions. I think one of the most insidious, I think it was a really interesting study that you probably saw, which was around people's estimates of how much of the welfare bill went on job seekers allowance, went on the unemployed. And it was, the public said 30%. The truth is 3%. How did they come up with that opinion? Well, unfortunately, we do have a largely conservative media which is down on the welfare state, particularly the element of it which helps working class people to live and fulfil their ambitions in life. And so they make out as if it is this crushing amount of money. And I think how you counter that is firstly, you create a plurality of voices in the media, and that's certainly what we're trying to do at the Canary. It's what others are doing elsewhere.
Thanks,
Carrie
Ann.
Absolutely critical.
Is that the original sin that we're talking about here? That you have an established media landscape that most people tune into or are involved with that is owned by a small section of society?
Well, yes, but all of the legitimate authoritative research shows that overwhelmingly, when you say to people, when you want to know what's happening, which is the source you turn to most often and which do you trust the most often, you'll be pleased to know, Clive, the BBC overwhelmingly dominates the media landscape in terms of people turning to it and trusting it, and trust is important, which is why the media landscape in general is less unhealthy here than it is elsewhere. I'm preaching for public service broadcasting because it is in peril. There are forces gathering that would like to see public service broadcasting, and the BBC in particular, undermined. And even though I am a critic of the BBC in many ways, I will defend it to the death. Not quite to the death. I will defend it as much as I could. Vigorously. But to come back to what you're asking me, eventually public exposure is the defence. So the point, there are some appalling figures, and we've heard one quoted, but public perception, for example, what is the black minority ethnic population of Britain? Opinion polls show people think it's 30%, when actually it's 8%. And all of these factors, and if you look at the roots of where these misbeliefs, they all tend to follow in the same direction of the right-wing tabloid agenda, I hate to say, but it's a fact.
Okay. I think we're going to draw it to a... I mean, this... You're going to have to be quick. Very, very quick.
Wow.
Make it speedy, please.
Petrarch, Italian, Renaissance, proto-humanist sage, famously said, humankind is its own worst enemy. Well, fake news, it's everywhere, isn't it? Camouflage in nature, illusions, and so forth. Shouldn't we, Ivor Gaber interestingly said that it's this idea of intentional deception that perhaps we need to address. What sources of deception are there that perhaps we might be unaware of? That's what I would like to ask. You know, Francis Bacon identified 4 idols. We go back to the ancient Greeks, Hermes, messenger of the gods. By understanding how we deceived, we become wise.
Right. Okay.
Just to round up, if I may, polymath.
Oh,
no less a voice than Einstein polymath. Read German philosophy steeped in ancient Greek thought. And what did he say? The problems that exist today can't be solved by the level of thinking that created them. But where in the media do we hear about this level of thinking?
All right.
Now, that's just my punchline, Clive. My punchline, okay? People like Donald Trump and Theresa May pride themselves on their confidence. But there's a saying, isn't there? Confidence is what one has when one doesn't understand the problem.
Right. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you very, very much indeed. I just want a very, very quick question to all of you in the audience here. How many of you actually believe that fake news is a real problem and is in fact corrosive of democracy? Okay, so I'd say a majority on this side, a majority there, and a majority, and those who don't believe it is the kind of issue that we should be worrying about. Okay.
Well, I think you asked the question the wrong way round.
Don't start talking about Plutarch. I really don't want to know. All right.
Is it worse than it's ever been? Possibly because of social media, but not really.
Right. All right. Okay. And you know what? I'm going to end it there. To our guests, Kerry-Ann, Neil, Ellen, and Ivor, and to you for being with us here tonight, and to all those who watched us online as well. Thanks to you all. Thank you.